Join me on my travels as I explore extraordinary places and reveal bizarre tales and characters from our capital's rich history. In this programme, a detective story set in 2 churchyards. Why over 100 years ago a policeman was given £1,000 in the street to help these children. And the dream of an East London vicar, which came true. High Halstow in Kent, out on the strip of land between the estuaries of the Thames and the Medway, just before you hit the North Sea, is almost as far away from anywhere as you can get in southeast England. There are only 2 roads leading into it, and it's surrounded by marshland. And at one time in its history, that was exactly how some residents liked it. That's because this part of Kent was full of a certain class of criminal. In the 1800s, this place was notorious. It had everything needed for a certain type of illicit business. The estuaries, many hidden landing points for boats, and a local population more than willing to turn a blind eye. To turn a blind eye to smuggling. It was more than just a criminal activity, it was a way of life. And there are still people living around here whose ancestors were in it up to their necks. Doug Marsh grew up around here. His great-grandparents were local farmers and were heavily involved in the local smuggling scene. Operating from their farmhouse, they made quite a lot of money.
My family started farming in 1640 at All Hallows, Slough Farm at All Hallows.
Your great-grandfather, I think it was actually prosecuted, wasn't he?
Yeah, for smuggling, yes. Or for receiving smuggled goods, I suppose.
So this is relatively quite recent, isn't it?
Oh, it would be in 1900, yes.
What happened to him then? He went to court?
He went to court. He was fined £5. He handed the £5 note over to the court, took another £5 note out of his pocket, lit it from a candle and lit his cigar from it.
This was to illustrate his contempt for the court?
Yes, I'm not sure what happened after that. I don't think he was seen for a few days.
So you come from quite a wealthy family then, because obviously there was a lot of money here.
Well, they were wealthy in those days, yes, they were. But unfortunately they were all gamblers and it was lost, I suppose.
They gambled all the money away that they earned from the smuggling?
They would gamble for fields.
Really?
They would gamble for a 5-acre field, yes.
Real smugglers were 2 a penny in this part of the country. But locally, it's actually a fictional criminal who's more famous, someone created by Charles Dickens, no less. In fact, he's so famous that 2 local villages are vying for ownership of his story. This is the church of St James in the local village of Cooling. Charles Dickens is known to have come for long walks all around this area. The local people of Cooling will tell you that he found the inspiration for one of the most famous scenes from one of his most famous stories right here. In Great Expectations, the hero of the tale, the young boy Pip, is grabbed by an escaped convict, Magwitch, one of the most vivid and terrifying characters Dickens ever created. It happens in a churchyard, according to the residents of Cooling, this churchyard. Dickens wrote, "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from amongst the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell me your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." In the book, the scene is set in a churchyard with 6 lozenges. A lozenge is a child's burial stone. The church here has lozenges, but there are 13 of them, all belonging to the local Compton family. Dickens also describes it as a church with a spire, and indeed, St James has a spire. It's also described as being close to the Kent marshes, and the church here is right by them. So, Cooling has always been believed to be the inspiration behind one of Dickens' most loved scenes. Even Dickens' own agent said he thought Cooling Village was indeed the right place. But there's a problem. Unlike the church in the book, St James in Cooling doesn't have a forge nearby, nor does it have the correct number of those children's graves. Although that hasn't stopped tourists from flocking to what they think is the churchyard that inspired Dickens, who really put Cooling on the map. But if you walk back down the road here to High Halstow, you can see a rival, a churchyard that has all the things Cooling Church has, and a few more. So here we are in High. In a tale about criminals set in smuggling country, you might expect to find an officer of the law. Here he is. David Stevenson is a former Met police detective, and he's used to picking over the evidence and building up a convincing argument for his case. He thinks the church here at High Halstow should go down in the history books as the place that inspired Dickens, not St James at Cooling. So what makes you think the place Dickens was writing about was here and not Cooling?
Basically because of the 5 lozenges. In the book, The Great Expectations, Dickens mentions the 5 lozenges of the small children, the brothers of Pip. Here we've got 6, but at the time the book was published, I think it was about 1860, there was only 5. The 6th was added later. The
lozenges are actually very close to the door of the church. Now,
yes,
that's
exactly.
Significant, isn't it?
Oh, it is indeed. In the book he described them being by the door of the church, and that the tombstone of his parents being adjacent or alongside, and Mac Richard been hiding behind the tombstone. But he specifically mentions just by the door of the church. And in fact, this is the only place where you've got 5 lozenges of very small children, yes, which is situated by a church. I don't know if there are any others, certainly not in this area, there are not. And there are other similarities. There's the forge. You've got Forge House, which is just down the road there. That was up and running at the time of Dickens, and he'd have heard the sounds and what have you. So I believe that the opening scene, the pathos of that opening scene with the small children, the brothers of Pip, and him going to see the tombstone of his parents and his brothers at the church, I think Dickens probably had seen this at some time or other and had used this as part of his experiences that he drew together to write the book.
For the residents of Cooling, of course, the fact that their church apparently doesn't fit the bill could prove a little disappointing. But for an ex-policeman, it's all about evidence.
Facts are facts. I mean, I really don't see how one can say that 5 lozenges of small children outside a door of a church related to an inspiration from Cooling, no matter how beautiful Cooling is, and it is. Whether 1 or 2 people there would object strongly or not, well, that's a matter for them.
You don't mind upsetting 1 or 2 Cooling folk?
Oh, would they be upset? I mean, we're talking about an author, we're talking about a really great author. What I would recommend is that if anybody does feel upset, to read the book, yeah?
And draw their own conclusions.
And draw their own conclusions.
Places with connections to famous books tend to play up their heritage. But this little detective story can really only be solved by one person. And Charles Dickens died in 1870. There could have been no greater memorial to the memory of my husband than the kindness you have shown my daughter. That rather lovely testimonial comes from an unlikely source. It's what the widow of a dead policeman wrote to the unique institution that had looked after her daughter so well. That institution the widow wrote to closed in the 1930s. All its records are now here in this building. They're the stories of the orphans of metropolitan and city police officers who died in service. And those stories are now the centre of intense interest. The orphanage is receiving hundreds of inquiries from all around the world as people try to put together the pieces of their own family history. And for many of them, the semi here in Putney, South London, holds the key. The founder of the police orphanage, Colonel Sir Edmund Henderson, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, had a vision for how the children would be cared for. Henderson knew in the 1870s, for example, if an officer died as a result of injuries incurred during the course of his duties, his widow would get just £15 annually, plus £2 10 shillings for each child, at a time when the welfare state, as we know it, didn't exist. At the time, the prospect of living in the conditions of most orphanages would have filled children with dread. Henderson helped create a place that many considered offered children much better conditions and education than they'd have had even if they still had both parents. In time, the orphanage came to occupy 15 acres in Twickenham and included its own swimming pool, gymnasium, hospital, workshop, and even a cinema. But the institution devoured funds. All serving officers made a donation each month, and every police station was fitted with a charity box like this one so that members of the public could make a donation, and some of them were extremely generous. In 1896, a policeman was stopped walking down the street and handed a cheque for £1,000 for the fund, a huge sum for those days. Donations like that meant Don Webb could come here nearly 80 years ago when his family couldn't afford to keep him. And Ray Lane could come here quite recently to find the orphan great-uncle he never knew. Don Webb was just 7 years old when his father died while serving as a police officer in Tooting. In 1928, he was sent to the Metropolitan and City Police Orphanage in Twickenham because his family couldn't afford to keep him at home. What was your first day at this place like?
April the 29th. I went there with my mother, and matron said, well, off you go, you could go and play, Donald, and off I went, without a backward glance.
So you didn't say goodbye to your mum?
Well, I did, but I left rather quickly. I think my mother was a bit upset at the time that I went straight off like that, but...
You were glad to get away from it?
Well, not really.
Well, that's what she thought. Don remembers his times here fondly. He left as head boy, won the Commissioner's Prize, and received an education good enough for him to pass entrance for RAF aircrew. So ultimately, did you think you'd been held back by going to an orphanage or not?
Well, no. I think the common thought about orphanages are generally that poor little devils. Wasn't like that at all. It was a jolly good school.
And like every other leaver, he got his trunk to start his new life with a full set of clothes. 4 pairs of socks, but only 2 pairs of pants. And a hat?
Yeah, hat. Overcoat.
What sort of a hat was it?
Trilby. Trilby hat.
So you've got everything you need to face the outside
That's
world.
right, yes.
Boots, slippers, toothbrush, and a Bible. Was that of any
I
use?
still had the Bible.
You kept that? Have you kept any other things? Don left the orphanage in 1936, a year before it closed. By that time, police pensions had been introduced and widows could afford to keep their children at home. People wanting to trace stories like Don's usually speak to Mick Park. He's one of the administrators of the modern-day Orphans Fund. Ray Lane was trying to trace his lost great-uncle Thomas Pinch when his search brought him to this plaque from the orphanage. Thomas Pinch is commemorated here, one of the old scholars who served in the First World War. It confirmed to Ray that his great-uncle had been a police orphan.
Done the research that you requested, and we've been able to find Thomas Pinch as having been in the orphanage.
The record showed Thomas Pinch had spent 5 years at the orphanage. And for Ray, it was a chance to at last discover something of the life of a great-uncle he never knew he had. So was this the first time you knew the existence of this great-uncle?
Yes, I'd never heard him. My mother never mentioned him to me. I was totally unaware that I had a great-uncle who was a casualty of the First World War, and that kindled my interest.
Now, you wanted to find out more about him. Why? What propelled you in this search?
He was a young man. He was not 21, he was in his 21st year, gave his life for his country, and I thought it's time somebody looked into him and found out a bit more about him.
So his father obviously was a policeman. What happened to him?
According to the newspaper reports, he was on a large fraud trial in the city, and he was being used as the modern idiom would say, I suppose, a stakeout. in extremely adverse weather conditions, and he caught pneumonia. And he recovered from that, but it affected his heart, and unfortunately he died at 40 years old.
What have you managed to find out about your great-uncle as a pupil here?
When he entered, he was average to perhaps slightly lower than average, but I noticed with interest that each year his standard of behaviour and his educational standards improved till I think the last report he had in 1908, he was very good.
So he obviously did pretty well here, didn't he?
He did. I think his time here must have stand him in good stead.
Ray eventually tracked down many of the facts about his great-uncle's life. He was a lance corporal in the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Scots Regiment and was killed in action in Flanders on the 27th of August 1914. Ray found his grave in France and laid a wreath on behalf of all his family.
I do feel a bit of pride that I managed to get this young man's history back into shape. I mean, a man who was killed at 20 years old, apparently forgotten. I don't think they should be forgotten. There's too much memories there to forget people like that.
A Wednesday evening in Dagenham, and here at this local school a regular meeting is about to take place. But it's not a slimming club or martial arts or amateur dramatics. Instead, it's a group which is over 70 years old and in its own way has become something of a national institution. These are the Dagenham Girl Pipers in all their glory. Grace Simmons joined the Pipers in 1937 when she left school, and she's now the secretary of the Veterans Association and one of the enthusiastic guardians of its history. In 1930, Reverend Joseph Graves had a vision of girls in his parish in Dagenham devoting their time and energy to a new skill.
He had the idea, because he loved the bagpipes, that he'd like to hear the band. I don't know, it was magic really. I mean, you don't meet anybody like this, do you, that would imagine this. And he wrote to all the parents of these 12 little girls that were in his Sunday school to ask them if they would like their girls to learn to play the bagpipes. And they all agreed. He envisaged that they would march in the Lord Mayor show, they would become famous, and they would march in America.
All of those dreams of the Reverend Joseph Graves were to come true.
These are some of the 12 girls.
Those girls began what's become an institution. But at the very beginning they had to learn a crucial skill, of course, playing the bagpipes. The Reverend Graves asked this man, Pipe Major Cameron, to instruct them.
He said, "Oh no, it's not a woman's instrument," and he wouldn't hear of it. But then he changed his mind, and he came down and listened to them after they'd got the music ready, you know, and were able to put on some show. And he said, "Their names are bad," and he took on the job.
The Pipers went from strength to strength with a succession of performances, strong recruitment and a strict regime of training, discipline and attendance.
Where are you?
There.
Oh, great. Oh, pretty girl. Look fantastic, don't they? You are, look.
Well, they were all pretty girls,
pretty, yeah.
because we weren't allowed to wear makeup. I have to use it now, you see, to sort of right now.
I'd
but
never have
we
noticed
were
that.
never allowed to use makeup on stage or anywhere. We were not allowed to smoke. We were not allowed or encouraged to talk to boys. And we were chaperoned wherever we went by parents.
Did you enjoy it?
Absolutely. Just imagine marching and everybody round, and they were clapping and that, you know, the enthusiasm from the people that watched us made us proud that we were good at the job.
Because it really took off, didn't it?
It did. We were now established entertainers, so we were professional, and we all got paid. As I say, 9 and 8 a week I got.
Did you? So this was your living then?
Well, yes. The first engagement I had was in Ostend, and we played at Ostend Casino with Maurice Chevalier
Maurice Chevalier.
and Josephine Baker.
And what was it like for a young girl from Dagenham to be performing next to
It was
Maurice
wonderful.
Chevalier?
We saw a lady with blue hair. Because we were all young, you know, saying, "Here, look at that lady. She's got blue hair." And to go there, we had to go to Bow Street Police Court to see the magistrate so that he could approve that we travelled abroad and we would be chaperoned.
Because you were minors, weren't
That's
you?
right.
Yeah.
This is a photograph of a Royal Command performance. You can just make out the stars of the show, Laurel and Hardy. Also on the bill, the now famous Dagenham Girl Pipers.
Laurel and Hardy, look, there they are right at the front.
Yeah, well, they were the stars. And Racy Fields and, oh, so many of them.
By this stage, the Dagenham girls really are world-famous stars.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
But perhaps their most extraordinary performance ever took place in Berlin in 1937. Not because of who they performed with, but because of who was in the audience.
One of the evenings they were playing at the Winter Garden.
A huge place,
It
isn't it?
is. They found out that Hitler was sitting in the balcony with his lady.
Eva.
That's right.
So what an extraordinary thing, the Dagenham Girl Pipers end up playing in front of Hitler.
That's right, yeah.
Today, the Pipers are part-time volunteers who practice regularly for their performances at fêtes, hotels, parties and occasionally on television. But recruitment is not what it was, and it's more difficult to attract new talent. The mainstay of the Pipers are women who've been performing virtually all their lives.
How long have you been in charge of the band?
A long time. I can't actually remember a long time.
It's amazing, really, isn't it, that it's survived to this day?
Yeah, it gets tougher as the years go on, in all fairness, it really does, to keep the girls together. I mean, we've got very old girls here, and you will see that there are more older ones than younger ones.
Their average age has increased, but their enthusiasm to live out the extraordinary dream of a Dagenham vicar to create a world-renowned band from local schoolgirls lives on.